Alison's life was a patchwork of quiet determination and resilience. At just 20 years old, she had endured more heartache than most people experienced in a lifetime. Her parents, who had been her guiding light, had passed away within months of each other due to a relentless illness, leaving Alison to navigate the world alone. The farm they had left her was both her sanctuary and her burden. Every acre held memories of her childhood, of laughter, hard work, and the comforting presence of her parents. Yet it was also a constant reminder of her solitude and the responsibility she now carried. The farm itself wasn't much to look at. A modest plot of land surrounded by rolling hills. It was dotted with patches of vibrant green and areas that needed more care than Alison had time to give. Her days were long and exhausting, filled with planting, harvesting, and tending to the few animals she kept. Despite the physical toll, Alison found solace in her routine. The farm was her connection to her parents, and every crop she nurtured felt like a tribute to their memory. One late summer afternoon, as Alison was inspecting her crops, she noticed something unusual near the edge of her property. It was a movement, a flicker of black against the golden hue of the fields. At first, she thought it might be a stray dog, or even a deer. Curiosity piqued, she set down her tools and approached cautiously. As she drew nearer, the figure took shape. A small, scrawny horse with a patchy black coat. Its mane was tangled, and its ribs were visible through its thin frame. The horse stood still, its large, expressive eyes fixed on Alison. "Where did you come from?" she murmured, her voice soft and gentle. She could see the fear and wariness in the horse's eyes, a look that spoke of hardship and abandonment. Alison's heart ached for the creature. It was clear that the horse had been left to fend for itself, a victim of neglect or worse. The horse flinched as Alison took a step closer, but it didn't run. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, as if acknowledging her presence but remaining on guard. Alison reached into her pocket and pulled out a small handful of oats she had been snacking on. Kneeling down, she extended her hand slowly, offering the food. The horse hesitated, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. Hunger eventually overpowered its fear, and it took a tentative step forward, then another, until it was close enough to eat from Alison's hand. "There you go," Alison said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're safe now." It was in that moment that Alison made her decision. She couldn't leave the horse to fend for itself, not when it was so clearly in need of care. She gently coaxed the horse to follow her, using the oats to guide it. The journey back to her farmhouse was slow and cautious, with the horse stopping frequently to look around as if unsure whether to trust this human. When they finally reached the farmhouse, Alison set to work immediately. She didn't have a proper stable, but she cleared out a section of her small barn, lining the floor with fresh straw and setting out water and hay. She named the horse Shadow, inspired by its dark coat and the way it seemed to move silently, almost blending into its surroundings. Shadow seemed to sense her kindness, and while it remained skittish, there was a glimmer of trust in its eyes. The next few weeks were a blur of hard work and nurturing. Alison spent hours grooming Shadow, untangling its matted mane and cleaning its hooves. She consulted books and local veterinarians to ensure it received proper care and nutrition. Slowly but surely, Shadow began to gain weight, its coat becoming shinier and its demeanor more relaxed. Word of Alison's new companion spread quickly through the village. People were curious about the ugly horse she had adopted, and they weren't shy about sharing their opinions. "Why waste your time on that?" one villager scoffed when he saw Shadow for the first time. "It's not like it'll ever amount to anything." Alison bristled at their words but refused to let them affect her. She saw something in Shadow that no one else did, a quiet strength, a resilience that mirrored her own. "Beauty isn't everything," she would say firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Shadow is worth more than you know." Despite her defenses, the villagers' mockery stung. Children teased Shadow, calling it names and imitating its awkward gait. Adults shook their heads in disbelief, wondering why Alison, a struggling farmer, would burden herself with such a seemingly useless creature. But Alison stood by her decision. Shadow was more than just a horse to her. It was a symbol of hope and second chances. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Alison and Shadow became inseparable. Shadow followed her around the farm, its once timid nature replaced by a quiet confidence. Alison often spoke to it as she worked, sharing her thoughts and dreams. In Shadow she found a companion who listened without judgment, whose presence filled the void left by her parents. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Alison sat on the steps of her farmhouse, watching Shadow graze in the distance. She couldn't help but smile. For all the ridicule and doubt, she knew she had made the right choice. Shadow had brought a sense of purpose and joy back into her life, and she was determined to give it the love and care it deserved. But Alison couldn't have known that Shadow's true worth was yet to be revealed. The events that would unfold in the years to come would not only change her life, but also transform the way the entire village saw the ugly horse they had once mocked. As the weeks turned into months, Shadow became an inseparable part of Alison's life. Though he was still smaller than most horses his age and retained his rough, imperfect appearance, his personality shone brighter than any polished coat ever could. Shadow was intelligent, almost unnervingly so. He seemed to understand Alison's moods, reacting with a comforting nuzzle or a gentle nicker whenever she was troubled. On long, quiet evenings, Alison would sit on a makeshift stool in the barn, talking to Shadow about her hopes and fears. "I know they laugh at you," she'd say, running her fingers through his mane, "but they don't see what I see. You're special, Shadow. I just know it." Shadow would flick his ears toward her voice, as if soaking in every word. Despite the peace Shadow brought to her life, Alison couldn't escape the villagers' judgment. Each trip to the market brought a fresh wave of ridicule. "Still feeding that ugly thing," one farmer jeered as Alison loaded sacks of grain onto her cart. "He'll eat you out of house and home before he's ever good for anything." Even the children weren't kind. They'd gather near the fence of her farm, pointing and giggling at Shadow as he grazed. "Look at that scruffy thing," they'd shout. "Why doesn't she get a real horse?" Alison wanted to defend Shadow, to tell them how much he meant to her, but she knew her words would fall on deaf ears. Instead, she focused on caring for him, determined to prove them all wrong someday. One evening, Alison decided to take Shadow for a walk through the village. She hoped that by seeing him up close, people might begin to appreciate his gentle nature. Shadow trotted alongside her, his head held high despite the whispers and smirks they encountered. Alison smiled, patting his neck. "You're doing great, boy," she said softly. But the villagers were relentless. As they passed the local tavern, a group of men burst into laughter. "Hey, Alison, lose a bet or something," one of them called out, gesturing to Shadow. "I've seen mules prettier than that." Alison's cheeks burned with anger, but she kept walking, her hand steady on Shadow's reins. Shadow, seemingly unaffected, nudged her arm with his nose as if to say, "It's okay, let them laugh." Back at the farm, Alison couldn't hold back her tears. She sank to her knees in the barn, her face buried in her hands. Shadow stood over her, his large, warm eyes filled with concern. He lowered his head, resting it gently on her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. "You're all I have, Shadow," she whispered, "and I won't give up on you, not ever." Over time, Shadow began to show a side of himself that no one, not even Alison, had expected. He was fiercely protective of her and the farm. One day a stray dog wandered onto the property, growling and snapping at the chickens. Before Alison could react, Shadow charged across the yard, positioning himself between the dog and the terrified birds. With a loud, commanding whinny, he sent the intruder running. Word of Shadow's bravery began to spread, though it didn't completely silence the naysayers. "Even a broken clock's right twice a day," one villager muttered when Alison recounted the story at the market. But Alison didn't care. To her, Shadow was more than just a protector. He was family. Alison started noticing other remarkable traits in Shadow. He had an uncanny ability to find his way home, even from unfamiliar places. On one occasion, Alison had taken him to a neighboring village to buy supplies. On the way back, they encountered a fallen tree blocking the road. Unsure of how to proceed, Alison dismounted and tried to find an alternate route. Shadow, however, seemed to sense her hesitation. With a determined snort, he led her through a narrow path in the woods, navigating twists and turns with an ease that left Alison in awe. "I don't know how you do it," she said, scratching his ears once they were back on the main road. "You're smarter than half the people I know." Shadow's intelligence wasn't the only thing that set him apart. He had an almost magnetic presence that drew other animals to him. Birds often perched on the fence of his enclosure, chirping merrily as if sharing secrets. Even the skittish barn cat seemed to trust him, curling up near his hooves without fear. Alison began to see Shadow as more than just a horse. He was a guardian, a kindred spirit, and a beacon of hope. The bond between Alison and Shadow grew stronger with each passing day. They became a team, tackling the challenges of farm life together. Alison often wondered if Shadow understood just how much he meant to her. "You saved me as much as I saved you," she'd say, brushing his coat under the soft glow of the barn lantern. Shadow would respond with a soft whicker, his eyes full of quiet understanding. But Alison had no idea that Shadow's true purpose had yet to reveal itself. The days of ridicule and doubt were numbered, and soon the villagers would see the ugly horse in a light they never imagined. Shadow's moment of heroism was approaching, and when it came, it would change everything. The day began like any other in the village. A bustling festival had drawn nearly every family to the main square. The smell of roasted corn and freshly baked bread mingled with the cheerful laughter of children running between stalls. Alison, hesitant to leave her farm, decided to make an exception that day. She didn't bring Shadow, thinking the crowded streets might overwhelm him. Instead, she spent a quiet morning with him before heading into the village on foot, promising to return by sundown. What Alison couldn't have known was that this day would end in chaos, marking the beginning of a legend. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the festival reached its peak, an ominous plume of smoke began to rise from one of the larger tents near the edge of the square. At first, no one noticed, but within moments the flames spread rapidly, licking the sky in a blaze of orange and red. Panic erupted as the crowd realized the fire was out of control. Parents scrambled to gather their children, vendors abandoned their stalls, and a chaotic rush ensued toward safety. Amid the pandemonium, a heart-stopping cry pierced the air. A group of children, drawn by curiosity, had ventured into the tent just before the fire started. Now, trapped by the encroaching flames, they screamed for help, their small figures barely visible through the thick smoke. The villagers hesitated. The fire was spreading too quickly, and entering the blaze seemed like a death sentence. Some men tried, wrapping wet cloths around their faces, but the heat forced them back almost immediately. Alison, arriving just as the chaos unfolded, felt her heart sink. The sight of the children's terrified faces was unbearable, and yet she too was frozen by the sheer intensity of the flames. Back at the farm, Shadow had sensed something was wrong. It was as if he could feel Alison's fear across the distance. Pacing restlessly in his enclosure, he let out a series of loud, urgent whinnies. When no one came to release him, Shadow did something extraordinary. He leapt over the fence. Galloping at full speed, Shadow navigated the narrow, winding roads toward the village. His hooves thundered against the dirt, his dark coat blending into the shadows of the evening. Villagers later swore they heard the sound of his approach long before they saw him, a rhythmic, determined beat that seemed to echo through the hills. By the time Shadow reached the square, the fire had consumed nearly half the tent, and the children's cries had weakened. Alison, standing at the edge of the crowd, was stunned to see him. "Shadow," she whispered, her voice choked with disbelief. But Shadow wasn't there for reassurance. He was there to act. Without hesitation, Shadow charged toward the flames. The crowd gasped, their ridicule and scorn forgotten in the face of his bravery. "He'll never make it," someone shouted, but Shadow didn't falter. Lowering his head, he pushed through the heat and smoke, his keen instincts guiding him to the source of the cries. Inside the tent, the children huddled together, their faces streaked with soot and tears. When they saw Shadow emerge from the smoke, their fear momentarily gave way to awe. Shadow whinnied loudly, urging them to move. One by one, the children clung to his mane and sides as he carefully guided them toward the exit. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers as the first child emerged, then another and another. Shadow made several trips, each time braving the inferno to ensure no one was left behind. Alison could barely contain her emotions, tears streaming down her face as she watched the horse she had always believed in prove his worth in the most extraordinary way. When the last child was safe, Shadow finally emerged, his coat singed and his breathing labored, but his spirit unbroken. The crowd, once so quick to mock him, now fell silent, their disbelief giving way to admiration and gratitude. Parents rushed forward to thank him, their hands trembling as they stroked his soot-covered mane. Alison ran to him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You did it, Shadow," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're a hero." For the first time, the villagers saw Shadow not as an ugly horse, but as a symbol of courage and selflessness. The very traits they had once mocked now inspired awe and respect. Children who had laughed at him before now gazed at him with wide-eyed wonder, their small hands reaching out to touch the hero who had saved their lives. From that day forward, Shadow's name was spoken with reverence. The villagers built a small monument in his honor, a simple plaque near the square that read, "To Shadow, the horse who taught us the true meaning of beauty." Alison, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, found herself at the center of a newfound community. For the first time since her parents' passing, she didn't feel alone. Shadow had not only saved lives, he had brought the village together in a way no one else could have. In the days following Shadow's heroic rescue, the village was abuzz with stories of the remarkable horse and his extraordinary act of bravery. People who had once dismissed him as ugly and unworthy now sought every opportunity to visit Alison's farm, eager to catch a glimpse of the horse who had become a local legend. Shadow himself seemed unaware of his newfound fame. He continued his daily routine with the same quiet dignity, grazing in the fields and nuzzling Alison for treats. But Alison noticed subtle changes in his demeanor, an air of pride, perhaps, or a deeper connection to the people who now regarded him with admiration instead of scorn. The villagers, humbled by Shadow's selflessness, began to change in ways Alison hadn't anticipated. The children who had once mocked Shadow now visited him regularly, bringing carrots and apples as peace offerings. They'd gather around him in the afternoons, listening intently as Alison recounted the story of his rescue, each retelling filled with wonder and gratitude. "I used to think horses were just animals," one little girl confessed, her hand resting gently on Shadow's neck. "But Shadow's different, he's special." "He's more than special," Alison replied, her voice soft but firm. "He's a reminder that true beauty comes from the heart." Shadow's story spread far beyond the village, reaching neighboring towns and eventually drawing the attention of journalists and animal enthusiasts. Reporters arrived with cameras and notepads, eager to capture the tale of the ugly horse who became a hero. Alison, shy and unaccustomed to the spotlight, agreed to a few interviews, always emphasizing Shadow's bravery and the lessons he had taught her. "It's not about what's on the outside," she told one reporter, her hand resting protectively on Shadow's mane. "It's about what you're willing to do for others. Shadow showed us that." One day, a prominent equine trainer visited the farm, intrigued by Shadow's story. He offered to take Shadow to a prestigious horse show, believing his heroism deserved national recognition. Alison hesitated, torn between wanting the world to know Shadow's worth and fearing he might be overwhelmed by the attention. In the end, she declined. "Shadow doesn't need ribbons or trophies to prove his value," she explained. "He's already won the hearts of everyone who matters." Despite Alison's decision, Shadow's impact continued to grow. The village, inspired by his courage, began organizing annual events to celebrate acts of kindness and bravery. They named the festival Shadow's Day, a heartfelt tribute to the horse who had changed their lives. During the first Shadow's Day, Alison was asked to give a speech. Standing in the village square with Shadow by her side, she addressed the crowd. "Shadow taught us to look beyond appearances, to see the potential in everyone and everything," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "He reminded us that even in the darkest moments, there's a light waiting to shine. We just have to be willing to see it." The crowd erupted in applause, and Shadow let out a soft whinny as if acknowledging the praise. As the years passed, Shadow's legacy grew. Alison, once a solitary figure in the village, became a respected member of the community. Her farm thrived, thanks in part to the visitors who came to see Shadow and learn his story. But more than that, Alison felt a renewed sense of purpose. She began writing a book about Shadow, detailing their journey together and the lessons he had taught her. "It's not just his story," she explained to a friend. "It's a story about love, resilience, and the power of believing in something when no one else does." Shadow, now in his golden years, continued to live peacefully on the farm, surrounded by the love and admiration he had earned. Alison often wondered if he understood the depth of his impact, if he realized how many lives he had touched. On quiet evenings, as the sun set over the fields, Alison would sit with Shadow under the old oak tree, reflecting on their journey. "You changed everything, Shadow," she'd say, her voice filled with gratitude. "Not just for me, but for everyone." Shadow would nuzzle her gently, his dark eyes filled with a quiet wisdom that needed no words. And in those moments, Alison knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would always carry the lessons of Shadow's bravery and love with her. As for the villagers, they too carried those lessons forward, treating each other with more kindness and understanding. Shadow's legacy wasn't just about heroism, it was about transformation, the ability to see beauty in the unexpected and to find strength in unlikely places. Shadow may have started as the ugly horse, but he ended as a symbol of hope and a reminder that sometimes the greatest heroes come in the most unassuming forms.